Hey, what's up? It's Serena from Thrift. I know it's been a long time, right? Well, anyway, today I have a video for you and I think you're gonna love this. We are gonna talk about how I did the flooring, the vinyl plank flooring in my she shed. And if you've been following this journey for any length of time, you know that it's taken a long time to get here, right? So today in this video, which is being sponsored by Arrow Fastener, I'm gonna show you how I installed the vinyl plank flooring. I'm gonna show you the baseboards and the trim around the doors. So are you ready for this project? Let's jump into it right now. So when I ordered this shed last year from Tough Shed, there was no information anywhere about what kind of flooring they recommended. In fact, they even said, don't put vinyl down. It could cause moisture and mold problems. Well, honestly, vinyl plank flooring is probably the best option, especially if you've got an underlayment, because it's going to keep that moisture out. And I'm sorry, but keeping this floor as is, that wasn't an option. So just keep that in mind. That was an issue for me. And finally, I decided the plank flooring was the best option. And probably 3 or 4 years ago, I put some vinyl plank tiles just like this in my basement. I had no problem with the installation. And you see that it's got these little rubber tabs that lock it together in a floating floor. So this was going to work for me. Now, you know we have to talk about math, right? This is very simple. Screenshot this, plug your numbers in. It's very simple. You have to measure your width and length of your shed and then just convert it into inches. So for me, it's 186 inches by 306. And you also need the width and the length of the plank tile. So mine was 8.7 by 47.6. All you're going to do is divide those numbers. So 186 divided by 8.7, and that tells me that I've got 21, don't worry about the 0.38. I've got 21 full rows that are going to be installed from the right side of my shed to the left. And that's the direction that we're going to be installing, from the right to the left. And we also need to convert how many full-size planks are we going to be installing from the top of the shed to the other side, basically the width, or I should say the length. And that's going to be 6 full planks. So you'll need to round those numbers down and then multiply by the width and the length of the plank tile. So you see in this case, we get 182.7 and 285.6. And this is where we need to subtract that 186, which is the width of my shed, minus the amount of full planks that we will get going across the width of my shed. And it tells me that I'm going to have 3.3 inches left over. The reason why this is important is because you don't want to get to the end of your rows and have a really narrow piece. It doesn't look good, and it actually may be very difficult to do, and it may not be very secure. So we have to make sure that that 3.3 is accounted for on the front end or the back end. So what I mean by that is if that 3.3, whatever number you get, is less than half of one plank width, in this case 4.35 is half, then we need to actually trim that first plank to be a little smaller than the 8.7. We want to trim it to 6 inches. So just look at the math and see, but this will create a balanced floor layout so that you're not left with a really skinny piece or a really short piece at the end of your rows or your columns. All right, so I hope that makes sense. If you go to the blog post down below, you can find the link, or just click on the link to this spreadsheet. I actually put this together for you in Google Sheets so that you can plug in the size of your shed and the size of your planks and get all these numbers without you having to do the math. So I did the hard work for you. All right, so let's move on to the next part, which is putting down the underlayment. And the reason why I did the underlayment is because I wanted that extra protection against any kind of moisture that might be coming up from the bottom of the concrete foundation that it's sitting on. And it's easy to trim. Just take a utility knife, trim it, make sure it kind of fits underneath of the drywall, and you want to overlap those edges anywhere from 4 to 6 inches. 6 inches is probably good. I did 4, so not a big deal, but just make sure that you're using underlayment tape to secure that and cover the entire floor. My shed, you see on the left-hand side, that's where everything was pushed over to. So if you are someone who's not able to move everything out of your shed, then just push everything to one side, complete part of the shed, and then once that's done, move everything to the other side and then finish. That's what I had to do. I taped up 1/4-inch spacers along the perimeter so that I could leave that amount for an expansion gap. But here's where I went wrong. Remember the math that I went through just a few minutes ago? I didn't actually do the math. And so this plank should have been trimmed to about 6 inches wide, and I didn't do it. So you'll see in just a moment how when I got to the end of my row, I had a really skinny piece. So do as I say, not as I do. Now I did make the right decision to trim the very first plank in this row so that at the end, I wasn't left with a skinny piece. And to trim this, you can use a jigsaw, you can use a utility knife. Both, I think, are probably good to have on hand when you're doing vinyl plank tiles. Because remember, some of these cuts, you may need to actually cut the width, and you can really only do that with a jigsaw. All right, so actually connecting these is very, very simple. Again, it locks together, and all you have to do is to connect the ends and then use your mallet to just make sure that you've got a nice tight seam. So put it at a 45-degree angle, gently lower it, and then just tap the seam, and it should be pretty seamless. I like to run my hand over it to make sure that you don't feel any edges lifting up. When you get to the end of a row, you're going to have to trim this piece. So what I like to do is set the piece, a full piece, in place and see how much they overlap. In this case, it was about 5 1/4. And then turn your tape measure around and go to the other end of that piece closest to the wall. And that's where you want to trim that measurement. So in this case, I think it was 6 1/4. So that's where you want to trim it. Again, you can use a utility knife or you can use a jigsaw. And once you trim that, it should fit right in place. But again, keep in mind that you need to keep that 1/4 inch expansion gap closer to the wall. So yeah, make sure you account for that in your measurements. Now there's a couple things to keep in mind when you're putting your second row and your subsequent rows. You have to make sure there's at least 8 inches between that first seam and where the next seam is going to go. So where my foot is, that's where the seam is between the first row. So that needs to be at least 8 inches between where the next seam is going to go. This just makes sure that your floating floor remains strong and that you're not going to have any like weird seams. You'll use a tapping block to make sure you get all those connections tight, and sometimes you have to really push it in there. Your next piece, you're going to slide it into place at an angle, and you're going to keep going all the way up until you hit the other edge of the other plank and then lower it. And if it's not lying flat, then that means it's not in there straight. So if you have to gently pull it up and then reposition it, go ahead and do it. It's not going to hurt anything. But take your time with this because the gaps can really make your floor look very bad. That's not what you want. You want to get all those gaps out. So the tapping block is important, and you can put some weight on the first few rows as you're tapping so it doesn't shift your rows around. And as I mentioned, you're going to need to cut some of your planks. And so going over, scoring it maybe 3 times with a utility knife means that when you flip it over, you can put your foot on it and just pull up and it should snap. Sometimes it'll snap off completely, and other times you may need to use your knife and just kind of run it over that back part. And then you can start the next row. Now here, you have to be careful because if your piece, and I made this mistake, if your first piece is too short, guess what's going to happen when you get to the end of your row? You might be left with like a 2 or 3 inch piece, and that's just too short. That actually happened to me. I had like a 2 inch gap, and I'm like, oh, I didn't actually do my math properly. So just be mindful of that. And if you come up with any weird 2 inch gaps, which you'll see in a moment, I did. Some floors, you can get away with it. Other floors, it may look very odd. So just be sure, again, to do your math and make sure that your floor is going to be even and balanced. Anyway, I continued laying the floor. I want to say it probably took me about 2 or 3 days. I didn't have a lot of time to work on it all in one go, but I think if you're working on it in a weekend, you can easily get something like this done in a weekend. And you'll see here that by tapping it into place, you really do get rid of those gaps. So if you notice that there's any parts in your floor where you've got kind of an edge when you run your hand over it, be sure to go back with the mallet and fix that. And let's cover this part again, how to do these measurements. So you can take the measurement and leave that 1/4 inch gap close to the wall, of course. Turn your tape measure around and put that measurement onto your plank with the end hooked to the left and mark just like you see me doing here. Because remember, this is the part that we want. And we have to make sure that we're cutting it in the right direction because that edge has to be locked into and that edge as well has to be locked into this flooring system. This edge has to be kept. So we want to make that cut close to the wall. I know this may sound confusing, but this is where people can make mistakes. And I actually did it a couple of times myself, because you end up cutting and using the wrong piece for that measurement. So this is just a way to make sure that you are making accurate cuts. Now, this piece that we're cutting off, that actually is large enough that we can use that piece to start the next row. So that'll be the first plank on the next row. Now, remember, if it's too small, we're not going to start a row with a piece that's too small so that we end up with a small little gap, a very narrow piece. So you might have a little bit of waste, and that's why we always add 10% extra whenever we're ordering materials, especially flooring. But just make sure that you take your time, don't rush through it, so that you don't waste some of your material, because some of that extra you can take back and get a refund on boxes that are unopened. Now, that waste part that was just cut from the last row, we're using that to start this new row. So that cut edge is going to go next to the wall. We're going to line up those edges, keeping the 1/4 inch expansion gap, put that in place, tap it, and you can actually see here where that gap is disappearing and it's gone. That looks good. And this is what I ended up doing after about half of the room was done. I moved everything onto the finished side, and then I could complete the other side. And this is where I started getting a little nervous. As I got closer to the wall, I realized, wait a minute, I don't think I'm going to have any larger than a 2-inch piece here at the end. Like, that's very narrow. This is not what I wanted to happen. So I'll tell you how I handle that. But you'll see here that I'm using this little, I don't even know what you call it. But basically, as you get closer to the wall, you're not going to be able to use your mallet and your tapping block the same way. You're going to have to use this other little tool. Can't remember the name of it, but basically what it allows you to do is hook it onto the edge of the plank and still be able to use the mallet to close those gaps. Now here I actually did use my jigsaw to cut a 2-inch piece, and I was pleasantly surprised that it fit. It didn't seem like it was, an awkwardly looking piece. I didn't glue it down. Remember, this is a floating floor, so I didn't want to glue it down or anything. And the baseboard is going to go over top of it, so it wasn't too big of a deal. But remember, if I had done the math properly, that first plank would have been trimmed to about 6 inches, which means I would have had probably about a 4-inch piece, which was more balanced at this last row. So that's why the math is important. Now for the trim, I'm using a pine primed board. This is a 1x4, and I like more of a modern look. I don't like anything that looks too elaborate. I'm not going to use quarter round, and I am going to trim these corners and where I'm connecting these long pieces along the wall with 45-degree angles. It's very easy to do on a miter saw, and if you don't know how to use power tools, guess what? I do have a power tools course that I'm going to be working on soon, I promise. And it's going to help you make these kind of cuts and do these projects around your home or around your shed as well. I use the Arrow Fastener brad nailer. This is the PT18G because we have to secure this baseboard to the wall. And you also need a compressor too. So I got that loaded and ready, turned on the compressor, and finished making the cuts that I needed to join all these pieces along these long walls. And I was also doing trim around the door. This is a little smaller. This is a 1x3. And I noticed when I put it up there, it rocked back and forth a little. So I used shims and then used the 2-inch Arrow Fastener brad nails to secure the trim to the framing that goes around the door, which you can't see, it's behind the drywall. And that was actually pretty secure with the shims and putting the 2-inch brad nails every 2 inches, or every 12 inches rather. I didn't use liquid nails. You can, I didn't feel it was necessary. And I did use a flush saw to just trim those. You can use a utility knife, but I found that the saw works better, and then they would just snap right off. You'll notice that I'd started with the trim on the left-hand side and a 45-degree angle. This top part had a 45-degree angle on each side, and again, I needed to use shims. So I did one in the middle and then one on each side, and that made the top part pretty secure. And then the last piece I cut for the right-hand side, and you'll see that that trim is covering up where the edge of the door and the drywall meets. That's what we want. We want to cover up those raw edges, and it looked pretty good. Now, was it perfect? Not really. I still had some small gaps there, but Here at Thrift Diving, it's not about perfection. It's about good enough. So once I was able to get that in place, it looked pretty good, and I could always cover up any kind of gaps with wood filler or caulk. And I had to do the front double doors as well. Same issue. When I put the trim up there, it rocked back and forth. So I used some of the wooden pieces, the shims, and didn't have a problem. Now you'll probably wonder, like, why did I do the door first versus the baseboards? Because I wanted that door trim to come all the way down to the floor, and then that trim will be cut around those baseboards. You'll see in the corner, this is where the trim will meet, and those have been trimmed to 45-degree angles, and most walls are not 90 degrees, and so you may have some gaps. Don't worry, caulk will cover that. So the 2-inch brad nails, I'm shooting those in close to the bottom of the trim because I want those 2-inch nails to go into the bottom plate of the framing that's behind the drywall. And you don't want all of your nails to go into just the bottom plate. You want some of them to go into the studs, and I just didn't do it on this part. But you will see in a moment that I do go back and find the studs so that some of those nails I'm shooting into the baseboard is going into some of the studs. And this just makes it a lot more secure. When I get to the end, I use a tape measure to find what that measurement is, and then I have to cut a piece of trim at 45-degree angles in order to make as seamless of a seam as possible, and then 45 degrees at the corner. The other piece, again, will be 45 degrees, and then secure that with the 2-inch brad nails. And I should point out that when the baseboard meets the door trim, it's just a regular butt joint. You'll see here that I also used a stud finder as well to find the studs, and I went back through the room finding the studs where I'd previously missed and made sure that some of those 2-inch brad nails were going into the studs a little bit higher on that trim just to secure it. I did go back with some wood filler and with white paint and painted and filled all those nail holes. So it's pretty simple, right? It's not hard to do your own DIY vinyl plank flooring. However, you do need a few tools and materials. If you want to do this project and you need help with the calculations, don't worry, go to my blog post. You can find it down below in the description. And there's a spreadsheet. So all you have to do is enter your measurements and the size of your plank, and it'll tell you exactly how many rows of flooring that you're gonna need and all those calculations that I know can be like just confusing for a lot of people. Anyway, if you like this series of the DIY shed refinishing on the inside, go down below or click over here on the side because there's tons of videos that show you exactly how I went from like nothing in here to everything being done, from the foundation to the drywall, the electrical, all of those things. And come back again because next video, well, I don't want to say next video, next big project, I have 2 or 3, is I need to get something for the front. Like right now I'm still stepping on a pallet. I need to figure out what kind of organization I'm gonna have in here. And yeah, it's gonna be the hard part. All right guys, I will see you next video.